Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can feel free to do so by using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Abhinav, and good evening from Israel. Well, it's a historic night in Israel and the region. As I'm sure all of you by now know, an agreement to a ceasefire, to a hostage release, has been signed, or agreed to at least. What we do know is that the details still need to be finalized. Apparently it will go into effect 12:15 local time on Sunday. There's still some timetables that need to be worked out, exactly how, when, but these are really dotting the I's, crossing the T's, as they say. As far as Israel goes, the agreement, according to law, has to be taken to the cabinet tomorrow and then to the wider government. The cabinet is the security cabinet, and then to the government as a whole. After that, there will be 48 hours for anyone who would like to petition the Supreme Court in Israel against the release of any of the terrorists who will be released. I'm assuming that their names will be released in the coming hours or coming days, which will allow people to petition Israel's Supreme Court against it. But as we know from previous deals, the Supreme Court doesn't get involved. They have stated on many occasions, going back to the Shalit deal or even perhaps before that, that these decisions are the purview of the government and they won't get involved. But legally, I believe they have to at least entertain some of these petitions. So the big question that many people are asking is why now? The Biden administration, at least, are touting the fact that it's very similar to what President Biden himself talked about as far back as May and was agreed to at the time, perhaps by the Israelis. There's a debate about that. Was it agreed to entirely? Were there added ingredients? Was it sort of a wait and see what Hamas says? But the Biden administration, Secretary Blinken and others are very strong on the fact that there's nothing new in this agreement. The reason we got to where we are today is because of the work over the previous months, and everyone understood that now is the time for the deal. But the fact is that it's clear that the Trump effect was very central to the fact that it is now happening. Ever since the victory of incoming President Trump, we've seen various statements throughout the weeks, months, that there is an expectation that a deal will get done by the time of his inauguration. He, in fact, incoming President Trump sent many of his envoys to the region, the most crucial of which was Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, who had been in Doha in Qatar, where the negotiations had been taking place for the last couple of weeks, really putting himself in there. Apparently there was good coordination between the Trump and Biden administration in these last few days. But probably the most crucial meeting was when Witkoff came across to Jerusalem, met, some argue demanded to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and really convinced him to compromise on the last remaining details. Apparently that was, by some reports, a very heated meeting. Perhaps strong arm tactics were used, as suggested by some. And the question is, Was that more of a carrot, or was there a stick? Was there more of a stick? There have been many in Israel who have looked at President Trump's statement that if there is no agreement by the time I come into office, there'll be all hell to pay. Most people around the world figured that was a message to Hamas, and certainly a big part of it was to Hamas, but it's clear that there was a message in there for Netanyahu as well. As we know, the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu hasn't been at the highest up until recently. There seems to be a little bit of a rapprochement ever since he won the elections, but clearly the relationship soured after Trump lost his presidency and blames Netanyahu for stabbing him in the back, etc., etc. Some of the words that we used, etc. The relationship has obviously improved, but it's clear that it's still not where it was during the quote unquote bromance during the early years of the Trump presidency. So the question remains exactly how much of this was Netanyahu knowing that he needed to give Trump what he wanted at this point. Perhaps Trump threatened him in some way or threatened the relationship in some way. Perhaps, and we'll get to that a little bit later, there was a bit of a carrot. Could it be perhaps part of a promise to allow an Israel or even take part in the strike on Iran? Was it to do with Saudi normalization? Was it the threat of some sort of endorsement of a Palestinian state? Who knows? We may not know about these things, maybe ever, but certainly not at the moment. What we do know is that this was not a unanimous decision within Netanyahu's inner circle. Many of his advisors, and even, we are told, members of his inner family, that usually means either Sarah and one of the sons were against the deal, probably one of the sons who was against it. But the fact is that Bibi did come to an agreement that was pretty much been on the table for the last few months. So it's clear that Trump had a major effect. Now, why did Trump want this done? For many reasons. First of all, he wanted to come in on a win. There has been many who have compared this to when Ronald Reagan came in, when he replaced Carter, who was not able to get the hostages, the American hostages from the embassy in Tehran home for, I can't remember how many days, I think it was over a year. And as the Reagan inauguration was taking place, the hostages were being released, and it was a great victory to come into office with. Some are comparing it with that, but the fact is that Trump very much wants this war over for various reasons. He wants to push forward with expanding on the Abraham Accords. That would mean normalization with Saudi Arabia and possibly others, and wants to show that he's the man to stop wars. You know, there've been many who say that he saber rattles and he comes in and talks violently, but at the end of the day, he is the one who will come in and say, I stop wars and I stop them through strength. When I say something, people listen. This is very much the image he wants to create, and it's clear that something very much worked. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of the agreement, because a lot of that you can read online, and many more of the details will come out over the next few hours. But it's clear that the first phase, there will be 3 phases. There was a debate whether there's going to be 2 or 3, but according to the Qatari Prime Minister, who held a press conference, and then President Biden, who also held a press conference, there'll be 3 phases. The first phase will be 42 days, and there'll be a release of around 33 hostages. We still don't know how many of them are alive. There is a feeling that the majority of them, some have touted the number 24, will be released alive. There will be all the women, all the elderly, and those who are ill. I believe that they'll be released in groups of 2 or 3 every couple of days. They'll be accompanied by the release of hundreds of terrorists from Israeli jails, many of them serving life sentences for murder, mass murder. The debate at the moment is where they'll be released to. There is a disagreement in the security system. Some want them to be released to Gaza, some to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and some abroad. There is a general feeling that if they're released here, Israel can get to them, Israel can watch over them, and if necessary, deal with them. If they're released abroad, that obviously makes things far more complicated. But again, those are, I believe, are some of the details that still need to be worked out in the coming hours. During the first phase, I believe after 16 days, they'll start negotiations for the second phase. As to the parties themselves, it's clear that Hamas compromised on three of its four key points that it had been saying that it will not compromise over the last year. There will be no immediate upfront into the war, as it demanded to even enter into negotiations, no full removal of the IDF during the first initial stage, and there will be restrictions and inspections on displaced returning, especially to the northern Gaza Strip. So it's clear that Hamas had to compromise on those things. Now, many of those things may well, and according to what we've seen in the agreement, will happen after the end of phase 3. But these are things that Hamas said that they demanded up front. What we also know is that Hamas have obviously, as we've seen many times before, have already declared this a victory for the resistance, etc., etc. October 7th was glorious, and this is a result of the steadfastness of the Palestinian people and resistance, etc. What it does leave, and let's be in no doubt, it leaves Hamas in power. Hamas will be in control of these hundreds of trucks, humanitarian trucks. They will decide who and where and when to distribute them. When the rehabilitation starts, they will be very much in control, whether it will be Hamas by name or Hamas not by name. The fact is, Hamas will still run the show. And if everything goes to plan and all the phases go through, Hamas will remain in power in some respect. There doesn't seem to be too much alternative to that at this point. Israel has compromised on a number of things. The first is on the Philadelphia corridor, that all-important corridor that separates or stands in between the wider Gaza Strip and the Sinai. Netanyahu still claiming that Israel will not remove itself from there, but it's clear, according to the agreement, according to all interpretations of the agreement, that will happen whether it's on the 42nd day or the 50th day. Israel has committed to removing itself. Even during the early stages, Israel will remove itself from parts of the Philadelphia corridor. The Rafah crossing will open. The Egyptians will obviously man their side. There's talk of Palestinians manning their side. At this moment in time, the only Palestinians who could man such a thing are, again, either Hamas or people Hamas choose. So those are major compromises from the Israeli side. The question now remains is, can Bibi sell the agreement? First of all, to his government. I think there's very little doubt that he'll be able to get this through on the wider government. And even if he's not able to, the opposition has said that they're not going to try and fell the government on the basis of this. That would be considered very unpopular and unwise. And the majority of the government, especially with the ultra-Orthodox parties who have already come out and said that they'll support it, this will get through pretty convincingly. The question is what happens after that, because we already know that Itamar Ben-Gvir, his party will oppose it. He's already said that he will oppose it. But the question remains to what level Smotrich will oppose it. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, the head of religious Zionism. At first, Ben-Gvir publicly went to Smotrich, and we know they've been sniping at each other for quite a while. So a lot of this, well, this is almost completely political, said that the only way we stop this agreement is that if both parties resign from the government and prevent the deal from happening. Ben-Gvir is basically putting the challenge up into Smotrich, basically saying if Smotrich says yes, I'm the one who comes out and says I suggested it. This is Ben-Gvir. If he doesn't, Ben-Gvir will say, well, then I have no power because he doesn't have the numbers to bring down the government. Smotrich, understanding the ploy, has come out and said he is against the agreement, but he is not leaving the government at the moment. He is looking for some sort of commitment, and this is what he's come out with in the last few minutes, from Netanyahu some guarantees that the war will not end at the end of whatever phase of the deal that they get to. So this buys Smotrich some time. It dilutes Ben-Gvir's threat. They will both vote against this tomorrow, but they will not have the numbers. It will pass, but it basically just kicks the can down the road a little bit. Exactly how long they can stay in the government. A lot of it will depend on how Bibi is able to sell this deal to his base, to his potential base. Interestingly enough, the Prime Minister's office is still the only major player that hasn't put out something official. We've heard from the Americans, we've heard from the Qataris, we've even heard from Hamas. We have had President Herzog, but we know that the president's position in Israel is largely ceremonial. Netanyahu will spend the night, as well as trying to convince Smotrich to stay in the government. He will also be sitting with his advisors how best to sell this. This is a leader who's been saying for, 14, 15 months, promising the people absolute victory day in, day out, the end of Hamas. That will not happen if this agreement goes to the end and there is a permanent ceasefire. So how exactly does he sell this? Is there a danger to the government? Yes, there is a danger to this government. If Smotrich, after a few weeks, believes that there is no return to the fighting, that this agreement is going to a permanent ceasefire, then he could well leave the government. Him and Ben-Gvir will be enough to fell this government. They will lose their majority, and we could well be going to elections. So there is a lot of work for Netanyahu to do. He has to convince not just his more right-wing members of the government. Also, he has some people within his own party who certainly will reject this deal. And probably as the deal goes on and the hostages start coming back, there will be elation within Israeli society. Everyone from right to left wants to see the return of the hostages, but that will also be accompanied with pictures of some of the terrorists who will be released with the stories. There's talk already of some mass murderers. If you remember the Pesach Seder massacre in Netanya during the Second Intifada, there's talk of them being released, and so there will be a lot of antagonism, especially coming from the right. So it will take a lot of Netanyahu's political nous, his ability to convince, to really get him through the weeks ahead, the weeks and the months ahead. But we'll have to see exactly what happens. All the details are less important with the implementation. And as the deal with Hezbollah, a lot of what's going on and what's important is not necessarily what's written in the agreement, is what's being agreed to beyond that. As we know, in the agreement with Hezbollah, it was the sort of the annex or the secondary agreement or secret agreement with the Americans. Here, a lot of what will keep this agreement or not is what happens with President Trump and his team, what can be delivered, what are the carrots, what are the sticks. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I will begin with a question from our colleague at the Middle East Forum, Dexter Van Zyl. Hello, Dexter. Are Israeli officials and thought leaders preparing to deploy the testimony from the released hostages to highlight the suffering they endured under Hamas control?
I mean, as we saw in the first, to a certain extent, we can take some examples from the first agreement, but the people who are returning after well over a year are going to be in much worse shape, physically, mentally, psychologically. There'll be no comparison. So there'll be a lot more time. Perhaps they'll be kept further away from the public eye. As we know, when they were released last year, it was pretty quick till some of them, there were pictures of them smiling and celebrating. There'll be less of that because the people who are going to be returned are going to be a lot more broken. I'm sure details will come out in the days, the weeks, the months, probably after. Members of the family will want some things to be released. A lot of things, let's just put it this way, a lot of things that happened to the hostages who were released in the first arrangement didn't come out until months later, even some a year later, and some of the details are still not coming out because there is within Israel there is a sensitivity. People understand that the families, the individuals themselves, the hostages need that time. If details come out through the family with permission from the family, then yes, they will be released more widespread. But Israel has shown in the past that it has a greater sensitivity, and for them, the propaganda value is less important than ensuring these hostages receive the treatment they need in security, isolated as much as possible and given the time to recover, if that's possible, physically and mentally.
All right, thank you. Now, of course, you mentioned that it is widely understood that many of the hostages, including some of those who are set to be released, are no longer alive. In the event that they are returned in coffins or body bags, what effect will that have on the ceasefire deal as a whole, and what might Israel do as a consequence?
Well, there's already an understanding that uh, I mean, Israel talks about 98 hostages, but Israel knows dozens of them are already dead. Some of them have been confirmed, some of them are assumed. The big question, the Bibas family, one of the most famous symbols of the hostages, the two little ginger kids, they are on the list to be released in the first stage. The whole family, the husband, the wife, and the two children. Um, there is hope that they are alive, but there is a feeling that they almost certainly aren't. But even if very few people believe that they are, if hopefully it doesn't come to it, but if it does come to it and they are brought back not alive, it will be very hard. It will be very hard psychologically on the Israeli people. But I think as long as there are alive hostages to be released, I don't think that Israel will break it, whether Hamas breaks it or something happens. That remains to be seen. But I think Israel knows that there will be body bags, coffins, whatever it is, in that first stage. Israeli public is prepared for it. Whether they're prepared when they actually see the names and the shrouds or whatever it is, it'll be very difficult. But I think that there is still support for the agreement. Again, that will change over the days and the weeks as some of the details of what Israel's compromising on and what the reality, waking up at the end of this, that Hamas will still be in power. Hamas will not have been defeated. Yes, they would have taken a major beating and unable really probably to attack Israel for the foreseeable future. But is this, and this is the question that Israelis will start asking themselves, is this just another round that we've seen many times before, a far more bloody round, a far longer round? But at the end of the day, Hamas will still be there at the end of this. And what happened to Netanyahu's total victory slogan will be something that a lot of people will be asking themselves.
All right, thank you. Now, if Hamas does, in fact, break the ceasefire deal as they are known to do, will the war continue business as usual with the goal of completely eliminating Hamas, or will Israel continue to pursue a further deal to secure the release of the remaining hostages?
Well, that's the tightrope. Netanyahu will want to try and release as many hostages as possible, but he will also want to try and ensure that he's able to push Hamas even further. Now, what does that mean, the defeat of Hamas? There are many in the security establishments in Israel who believe that, yes, they've taken a massive beating, the top levels have been destroyed, whether it's Sinwar, Def, the battalion leaders, but they've been able to regroup and basically start what the last few months or longer has been guerrilla warfare. Now, Israel has shown that it keeps them, or the IDF has shown that it keeps them going back into areas that they had basically defeated Hamas, and then Hamas came back. You've got a million, almost 2 million Gazans, and Hamas are still in control. They still have money. They still control the distribution points of aid, etc., etc. So they're able to recruit and even refurbish some of the battalions that they've lost. So Is it possible that they could go back to destroying them? Perhaps Trump would give them a freer hand than perhaps the Biden administration did. Um, it's debatable exactly what Israel can do to completely wipe out Hamas, considering it really did take out so many of its high level symbols. So I think that's also part of the calculation at this point, that it's better to try and get as many hostages out as possible. If Hamas want to return to the war, I'm sure Israel have a plan, and Defense Minister Katz has basically called on the army to create a plan if this agreement doesn't go through to really push for the absolute destruction of Hamas. But that could be just to try and put more pressure on Hamas rather than actually anything new, because if they had a plan to absolutely destroy Hamas, the question would remain, why haven't they implemented that in the last few months? So it remains to be seen exactly what that would look like if this agreement does fall.
All right, thank you. Now, of course, we're all elated that we'll be seeing the release of a number of these hostages. But what is the feeling among Israelis about some of the concessions that have had to been made in the negotiation process?
Well, to get to an agreement, everyone knew there would be some concessions. We are seeing, or we have seen the last couple of days, as this agreement got closer and closer. Sort of the two sides come out to the streets in favor of the agreement and against, and there are demonstrations even tonight in Jerusalem against the deal, because the deal hasn't been ratified by Israel until tomorrow, until the government speaks. My particular view on this, and we've seen this in the past, is that there is support for the agreement, majority support for the agreement, understanding that there would have to be major compromises. But as those compromises come to the fore, as we start hearing the names of those, as maybe we see Hamas are coming out into the open in Gaza for the first time in many months, some military officials, as we start seeing these pictures, as we realize the price that has to be paid once we've received the hostages, I think the agreement will become less popular. Most Israelis, as you said, are relieved about the fact that hostages are coming home. But as we saw in this Shalit agreement, if I can compare, and there are some possible comparisons, but obviously many not, people wanted Gilad Shalit home, and they were delighted and elated when they saw him come home and salute the prime minister, etc., etc. But a lot of the supporters of the agreement then became detractors of it as they understood the price they had to pay. This is very different. But at the end of the day, I think the reaction will go in a similar manner as the agreement goes further and further away, and Israelis understand the price, that Hamas will remain in Gaza. It will remain in power, in control, and they will be able to rehabilitate in some way. And the question then remains is how long until another battle? And Israelis are afraid of that. Israelis thought, at least after October 7th, we cannot go back to what they call the rounds of fighting, where they launch attacks against us, we attack back, and then there's negotiations, and then there's a ceasefire, and we go again and again and again. There's a lot of people who felt enough. We have to do something different this time. Certainly Israel did do a lot different, but if it allows Hamas to regroup, rearm, rehabilitate, a lot of people were saying we didn't learn anything from October 7th.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. We have unfortunately reached the end of this week's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to brief us and update us.
Thank you.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout in your email inboxes for next week's upcoming podcast offerings. And if you have not already done so, I would invite you to please subscribe to the Middle East Forum's YouTube channel, where you can watch this series, as well as over 400 of our past podcast episodes. As always, we thank you all again for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.